Well, hello everyone. This is Cody Ramler. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm here to talk about emotional first aid. Hopefully you're all here to listen. If not, stay and hang out anyway. I promise it's a great training and hopefully you'll learn something. It is only about 50 minutes. There's going to be 5 to 10 minutes at the end. So if you have questions, I would ask that you save them until the end of the presentation. And you can ask them, you can just type them out in that question box. If for some reason we run over, because I tend to get a little chatty when it comes to topics I'm passionate about, and this is certainly one of them, someone from IBH, their clinical team, will follow up with you in an email. So this training is presented to you by your integrated behavioral health, and it's focused on emotional awareness in the workplace. So a lot of the examples that you hear me talk about today are workplace oriented, but the hope is that these skills will transfer from one area of life to another. And my goal for today is really that you just can hear one or two things that you can take away that you can use to improve your emotional recovery. All right. So we're going to cover what is an emotional event, some personal and workplace skills, some crisis skills, because those are, as you can imagine, different than general everyday emotional recovery skills. And we're going to talk a little bit at the end about this idea of unconditional acceptance. What is it? Why is it important? And how does it relate to emotional first aid? So we all face emotional events in our lives. And what I really want us to think about today is that they exist on a spectrum. So sometimes they can feel incredibly stressful, like being diagnosed with an illness or losing a loved one. But sometimes they're less serious, like maybe arguing with your kids or forgetting to run an errand. But regardless of their real or perceived severity, each of these emotional events cause feelings. And IBH offers a resilience training that covers this in a lot more detail. But stress events and stress responses are natural, they're natural responses to things that happen to us, right? The thing that we do as humans, and that's very natural and normal, is that we like to categorize and to list them in our brains. It's part of that organizational process we have as human beings. And we like to put them in categories of good or bad, right or wrong. So again, what I want us to think about today is kind of a reframe, and talking about or thinking about feelings as not being bad, but just being human reactions to things that happen to us that really do help us to navigate tough situations. Most people do navigate tough situations and feelings and recover quickly, but some people might need a little bit more help working through them. And there are things that we can do to prepare ourselves for some of those more challenging times that will make us more resilient. So feelings can become a problem when they're inappropriate or they don't match the severity of an emotional event, right? So let's say we might feel too much. Maybe we feel too often. Maybe some of us have been told we're too sensitive, we're hypersensitive, we're too much of an empath, or we feel too easily. Really small events can set us off. And this might make it seem like our world, our lives are overly stressful, even though the stress is coming from an intrinsic place. It's coming from our own thoughts rather than from those actual emotional events. So what I want the takeaway from this idea to be is that it's not necessarily an event itself that causes us to feel a certain way, but it's the meaning that we attach to it, right? So emotions can be really valuable sources of information, but it doesn't mean that that information is necessarily accurate. In fact, many of us can build really great habits of manufacturing or magnifying events. We attach meaning to something that might not necessarily be rooted in reality. So look at this example on your slide. You show up at work and your boss, you have a confrontation with your boss. They might yell at you, they might give you some criticism, and your thoughts immediately are, gosh, this person is so mean, she must hate me, I should quit, which leads to feelings of anger, maybe some shame, some anxiety, and your behavior is then probably a poor work performance, a poor attitude, maybe some bitterness and feelings of being resentful. However, let's take the same exact scenario and your thoughts are something along the lines of, boy, this person must be having a really hard day. This is unlike her, or this is out of character for this person. Or maybe it's motivation. I can do better. This person's right. Maybe this isn't the best product that I have delivered. And that can lead to feelings of empathy, optimism, more peace and calm, which will likely increase work performance and attitude, right? And certainly motivation. It can also help influence and increase connections and the desire to want to learn. So what we as humans often do is take action based on those feelings, which is what I just described in those scenarios. So if I feel it, it must be true, and therefore I'm going to behave accordingly. But we can take better care of ourselves if we practice better thought habits about these emotional events that we likely face daily. And in the psychological world, we call this cognitive reframing. So that's the purpose of emotional first aid. It's a collection of coping skills that help us take better care of ourselves, to build these skills, recover more successfully, and also to help us to understand and help other people, which can be really great in the workplace, particularly if you're in a management or supervisory role and it's part of your responsibility to take care of the people that work under you. So EFA skills will help you to think before you react, to avoid wasting time and energy, and to help others, like I mentioned, recover from some of these emotional events. So when we get a cut or an injury on our physical body, we put a bandage on it. Or when we fall and sprain or break our wrist, we go to the doctor, right? But what happens when we get hurt emotionally? Oftentimes people ignore emotional pain. Sometimes, like physical pain, it just goes away. But oftentimes it gets worse and we end up feeling like we have this overwhelming, unmanageable problem. So in the same way that you can train to provide first aid for physical injury, you can also apply first aid to emotional injury. Oops, sorry, I got click happy. Okay, so there is a difference between preparing or managing emotional events versus physical events. It's not that cut and dry, right? So for physical events, we usually take a training or do yearly refreshers. We get some sort of certification. Oftentimes we have those refreshers in the form of fire drills, earthquake drills, active shooter trainings, things like that. Unfortunately, with emotional first aid, I hope none of you think that you're going to get a certification at the end of this and be trained to provide this to anyone around you. But practicing these skills daily can make you more able and a lot more inclined to be able to help people around you and yourself when some of those bigger disasters or crises arise. It will also help you to be a more resilient person. You'll start to naturally be able to kind of check in with yourself to recognize how you're feeling. That can be a really hard task for some of us. Can help us to avoid worrying so much, exacerbating anxiety, and can help us to redefine failure and losses as they happen, because they do. Those are part of life. The more that you practice these skills, the better you're going to get at balancing life. So the message here, the take home, is to take emotional pain seriously. And in the psychological world, we call this somatization, where an emotional event can actually result in psychological or physical pain. It can manifest itself physically, and we see this all of the time in the form of heart attacks, even high blood pressure, things like that. That can be, the root of those can sometimes be psychological challenges or injuries. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty here. And I'm going to give you 5 EFA skills to practice daily. And the first one is learning to check in with yourself the same way you check in with someone that you care about. So a lot of times we don't necessarily recognize when we're feeling something, especially when it's a small feeling, it's not overwhelming yet. So I want to ask you, just take 1 second and ask yourself right now, how am I feeling in this very moment? Try to identify 1 or 2 emotions. Don't change anything. We're not being judgmental towards ourselves. We're just identifying a feeling. And if this is hard for you, it might be helpful to work on expanding some of your emotional vocabulary, and even increasing your awareness of how feelings manifest in your body. The second skill is to be kind to yourself. So becoming aware of negative self-talk is really important it's the first step in changing the way that we talk to ourselves and the way that we think about ourselves. And oftentimes, most of us have a really well-established inner critic, and we say things to ourselves that we'd never dream of saying to someone else, right? I'm so stupid, I do everything wrong, gosh, I can't do anything right, which can damage self-esteem, can hugely impact our resilience. So what I want us to do is try to treat yourself with the same compassion that you would offer to a friend. So one way to do that is when a negative thought enters your mind, I want you to think 3 positive. Now I know that this is not 1 for 1, and asking you to think of 3 positive things for every 1 negative can be overwhelming to some. But it's really important for us to train our brains to flip the script. I once listened to a training where researchers have found that on average, humans have 60 to 90,000 thoughts in a day. And 90% of those thoughts are the same thoughts that we had yesterday. So unless your life is wonderfully perfect and you want everything to be the same as it was yesterday and you want today to be the same and tomorrow to be the same, then by all means, don't change the way that you're thinking. But for most of us, that's not true. So intervening at this cognitive level is imperative if we want to change our emotional response to events and our ability to recover from some of those stressful events. So the third one is to avoid rumination. And I first want to identify the difference between rumination and worry. Everyone worries. That's a normal human response to things, but worry escalates to rumination when it starts happening too much, taking hours out of our day. It's like that hamster wheel that just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning, and it's hard or impossible to stop. Oftentimes, this happens in the form of replaying on repeat, distressing emotional events, things that we did wrong, things that we said that maybe could have hurt someone, and it's not a helpful way to heal any kind of wounds. Oftentimes we don't even realize that we're ruminating. It happens kind of in the background, and it's become such a normal response to things that it's hard to recognize that that's even what's going on. So one of the best ways to disrupt rumination is to try distracting yourself by doing some sort of activity that requires mental or physical attention, right? So anytime our brain is focused on something, even if we can distract it, even if it's 5 or 10%, rather than being 100% focused on that rumination, now we're only 90 or 95, right? So some things that have been found to be helpful could be exercise. It takes not only mental energy, but physical energy to exercise, and also stimulates the rush of endorphins. Playing with kids or walking the dog, something that has also a positive emotional response attached to it. Drawing, journaling, fishing. People can come up with all sorts of ideas that are really helpful to disrupt the ruminating. I also had a client once tell me that they scheduled time in their day to worry. They actually wrote it in the planner, and it was from 5 to 6 o'clock or 5 to 5:30 at night. And anytime that those worries or those ruminations would crop up during the day, they would tell themselves, not now. I have scheduled time for this particular worry later in the day, but right now I'm focused on whatever the task at hand is. And what they found was that when they came to that scheduled time to worry, oftentimes the worry or the rumination had resolved itself or absolved itself. So letting go of what we can't control is a huge part of this, right? So ask yourself, what can I change, if anything? And if there's nothing I can change, can I move on? Another way to incorporate some of these skills is to increase your mindfulness practice. And I'm not going to go into detail about what that is, but it's really about being present in the here and now. And so the more mindful we can be, the less likely we're going to be spending rehashing the past or worrying about the future. So if we start thinking about how to do better instead of ruminating, we typically start to feel stronger and accept ourselves more. So if we can really avoid focusing on what it is that we can't do, what it is that we can't do instead of what we can do, when we experience some sort of personal failure, like I mentioned, which we all will, make a list of what you'd like to control or change if you were to try again. So learning from our mistakes, learning from our failures. And then this idea of forgiveness. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the unconditional acceptance at the end of this presentation. But one of my favorite sayings is to grow through what you go through. So your mind is a garden, your thoughts are the seeds. You can grow flowers or you can grow weeds. And so even through failures and challenges and curveballs that life throws at us, if we can reframe our thoughts, we can help produce more flowers and less of those weeds. So skill number 5, reframing our thinking about a loss. So loss is really motivation and can be material for personal growth. So it allows us the ability to change our narrative, gives us a chance to maybe rethink or question or reprioritize the beliefs and values that are really important or what we want to be important to us. And of course, I'm talking, there's a difference in losses. They can vary greatly, right? So if some of these losses that you're experiencing feel really overwhelming, this is where you can reach out to your insurance company or EAP programs and seek help from someone, a professional, for more of that individual work. So another tactic for helping to find meaning in loss is to connect and support other people who have experienced a similar loss. And there's so much research that shows what connection can do to boost resilience, to improve recovery, emotional recovery. So reaching out and finding someone, a support group or a person to connect with who has also experienced a loss can really help move through your own pain and your own struggles. It actually decreases the fear and avoidance systems in our brain, and it activates the reward and caregiving systems, which really promotes resiliency. Right, so moving on from helping ourselves on a personal level to helping those around us at work. And let's face it, maybe prior to COVID, things may have changed now. In fact, I would bet that they probably have for most of us. We usually spend most of our time at work, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week with our coworkers. And now that's a little bit different where most of us are working from home or doing teleworking. But it's still really important to highlight some of these specific workplace skills. So like I mentioned before, we do spend time training to respond to physical injuries or crises in the workplace, those earthquake drills, fire drills, active shooter trainings, things like that. But most of us don't know how to react when someone around us is hurting emotionally and needs help. One of the reasons for that is it can just be less identifiable, right? So we tend to doubt our ability to recognize when someone's hurting. People can really mask it well. It also, oftentimes we doubt our abilities to effectively help. Like I mentioned, we don't get a certification in being emotionally first aid trained. But using your EFA skills can help others avoid psychological wounds and can also help protect yourself from being affected by their pain at work. There's a term that we talk about a lot in the psychological world, that's secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. And those impacts of stress, chronic stress and trauma can be as pervasive as if it happened to us firsthand. So we all react differently and respond differently to stress events. But perception is really a key component of stress. So your mindset is really what sets apart stressed out people from resilient people. And also keeping in mind that what is stressful to one person may not be stressful at all to another person, right? And this is obviously linked to how we perceive our ability to navigate or to manage the problem. So let's say one person might not be stressed out at all about getting a flat tire on their way to work, but will avoid having a tough conversation with a spouse or a family member like the plague because it causes too much anxiety. So this is all about differences in perception. All right, so 8 tangible take-homes, tips for using EFA to help others. The first is being a positive listener. When someone's stuck in some kind of rumination loop, they might just need a good listener to help them move on. The key is listening without judging, trying to pick up on cues of how that person feels, how they were hurt, help them identify the emotion and the information that it's relaying to them. Do they feel embarrassed? Are they insulted? Are they feeling a lack of connection, isolated? Encourage positive self-talk for them to talk about themselves like they would talk about you or someone else that they maybe care about. Repeat key moments of their story so they know that you're listening, but leave out any of the negative self-talk that they included. Ask how they'd feel if you were in their situation. Would they think you're foolish? Would they expect you to feel ashamed? Remind them to treat themselves the same way that they'd treat you or another coworker. And then help them reframe. So that cognitive reframing. Ask them what they would do differently next time. This can really help them to move past the incident by planning for their future. It can also increase feelings of empowerment and choice and promote hope that they have an opportunity to do differently next time, having learned from what they perceived as a failure or a mistake this time. Encouraging resolution, if possible, suggest that they talk about it with other people involved. You know, most of us don't want to hurt other people and will likely modify behaviors in the future. The best way to do this is in recommending assertive communication. It's the most effective type of communication that can prevent conflict. And in any kind of relationship, miscommunication is the #1 cause of conflict. Helping them to find closure. So recommend that they write down what happened to them and then write about how it could have gone better or differently. Writing can really help bring closure and can also help break the overthinking cycle. Writing also helps us to link the 2 hemispheres of our brain, and it increases our oxygen flow to the prefrontal cortex, which is where our decision making happens. And it can also help to lower cortisol levels in your body, which is the stress hormone. And then sharing mindfulness strategies. I mentioned mindfulness earlier, and oftentimes people are more inclined to try new techniques or new strategies if someone that they know and maybe trust recommends them. So share what works for you. You know, maybe going for a walk with them or suggesting other activities like breathing exercises. There's some really great apps out there that people can download on their phones now that have all sorts of mindfulness strategies to offer. And then recommending counseling if nothing else works. There's always the option of, you know, someone meeting with a professional if they seem like they're just really stuck in that feedback loop and they're not open to any of your suggestions. Okay, so crisis skills. There's the smaller everyday stuff and there's actual full-on crisis situations, right? And hopefully none of us have to experience these in our lifetime, or if we do, they're few and far between. But the first and most important thing to do, and it sounds very cliched, but is to take deep breaths, 5 slow, deep breaths, right? And the reason for this is that it actually helps us to, again, send oxygen flooding to that prefrontal cortex. Because when we experience some sort of trauma, and they can happen anywhere, including at work, the parts of our brain that are required for that higher level thinking and executive functioning shuts down. So when we have a stress response to something, our breath can really stimulate what we think about as the brakes of a car, slowing everything in your body down, right? So slowing down your heart rate, slowing down your blood pressure response, and flooding oxygen to the thinking part of your brain. The next thing, also sounding fairly cliched, is to remind yourself that this too shall pass. So recognizing that suffering and pain is temporary and it will pass. It's not permanent. On average, we experience, at the peak of an emotion, we experience about 60 to 90 seconds. So if you can think about it in the terms of like riding the wave, and just like a surfer rides the wave, it will peak and it will dissipate. So if you can stick it out for 60 to 90 seconds, you're much more able to then access some of these other secondary strategies that we're talking about. Believing in your ability to handle it. I think it was Henry Ford who said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're probably right. Don't take anything personally. People oftentimes will say things that they don't mean, or that come out sounding more harsh than we mean it when we're under intense stress. We've probably all been on both the giving and receiving end of that. And then trying to stick with your routine. So any kind of familiarity that you have already in place can really help to anchor you in times of crisis. So ask yourself this acronym, HALT. Am I hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? Because if any of those things are in place, everything is amplified. So get something to eat, trying to make sure that you're adequately rested, getting some sort of fresh air can be really helpful. Reminding yourself that crisis is a part of life. It's part of a human experience, and when it happens, it feels huge and overwhelming. That's why it's a crisis. But recognizing that people really do go through and survive enormously challenging experiences all the time. And I think we're all really inundated in that time right now with all of this effects of the coronavirus. So connect. I cannot emphasize this enough. We are social creatures and we need each other. And we heal up and recover a lot more quickly when we're connected to other people. Now, I know that's really challenging right now, but even connecting with a phone call, a text message, a Zoom or a Google Hangout meet can be really helpful and prevent further isolation. And oftentimes that isolation leads to depression and increased anxiety, and certainly does not help us to respond to any kind of emotional events, much less a crisis. So helping someone else who's just been through something traumatic, because remember, we all respond to stress and to trauma differently. So something that might not have been very traumatic for you might be the most traumatic experience that your coworker in the cubicle next to you has ever gone through. And so first and foremost, you want to make sure that you're okay. It's that analogy of, make sure when you're on an airplane that you give yourself the oxygen mask before you try to help the person next to you. So once you're okay, try to help others who might be suffering from emotional shock. Helping that other person, that coworker, or that friend might also really help you to feel better. So first you want to assess any kind of bodily injury, right? Any medical issues, physical needs first. Go to a safe place if possible, a physically a safe place. Stay with that person, so don't get up and act like nothing happened. Help them to stay dry or warm. Recognize that any kind of emotional response to trauma can include trembling, convulsing, and it's part of healing. It's better than numbing out. It's actually a sign that the person is moving the traumatic energy through their body and it's not getting stuck. But that can be really scary if we've never seen that happen firsthand. Know that it's normal. If the person wants to talk, listen to them without changing the subject, without interrupting. Give them the floor and give them the floor entirely. Encourage them to try to reconnect with their body. So trauma really cuts us off from our bodies. When we're in that fight or flight response, we tend to dissociate or kind of leave or check out from our bodies. And this is really helpful during a traumatic event, but we need to be able to reconnect afterwards so that we don't get stuck in that trauma response. So you can ask someone in emotional shock if you can have permission. This is key. To hold their hand or to squeeze their shoulder. You always want to ask permission. And if they're uncomfortable being touched, incorporate some grounding techniques. So ask them to describe the color of the room or the shirt that you're wearing. You can give them something to hold, like a coin or like a scarf, and ask them to describe to you how it feels. One of my favorite exercises is a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can smell, 2 things you can touch, 1 thing you can taste. You can do that in any order. But really just helping them to connect with their physical being and also their physical space and surroundings. So these are some slides that I just incorporated for today's presentation because I felt like it was so accurate with what we're going through, you know, as a globally, as a world right now with the coronavirus. And some of you may have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's this pyramid. And on the very bottom, you can think of it kind of like a ladder. On the very bottom of this pyramid are, you know, physiological needs. So those things that we need in order to literally survive: food, water, oxygen to breathe, a roof over our head, things like that. And as we move up the ladder, up the pyramid, we see these higher level needs like safety. This can be physical safety, emotional safety, security. And then you get higher up into belonging, connection, friendships, relationships, esteem, identity. How do I fit into the world? And then his very top of the pyramid, Maslow's kind of highest rung on this ladder, if you will, is self-actualization. And he argued that most of us will never achieve this in our lifetime, that it's something we're continually working toward, you know, our full potential. And the challenge with what we're going through right now is these are not, sorry, this is not changing. There we go. The idea is that our higher level needs can't be met if our lower level needs haven't been met yet. So you can see where the challenge arises as we're going through and living through this pandemic, right? Where for a lot of us, our physical and especially our safety needs are not able to be met when we're struggling with things like financial insecurity or instability. You know, a lot of people are losing their housing. They're losing the roof over their head. They're not able to provide for their families. They're not able to have enough income, financial income, to even be able to put food on the table. So how can our needs for safety be met in the middle of this global pandemic when we also have this direct threat to our health, the health of our loved ones, the health of our kids, of our elderly, right? And then you add in the space of this political turmoil that we're going through with an election coming up, in systemic injustice, general uncertainty across the board of the world that we're living in. I talked about this before, but our need for belonging and connection is really hard to be met when we have to be isolated or socially distanced, when we literally can't share air, which is a phrase I use often in my therapy practice with people. It's trying to find completely different and unique ways to connect than we've ever had to before. So it's really important to show yourself compassion and to realize that you're really trying to build a pyramid on an incredibly shaky foundation. And using some of these EFA skills are really going to help us to increase and improve that compassion, and also to help us get some of those lower level needs met so that we can move up that pyramid more effectively. And this is my positive thought for the day. Even if we can't quite see it, you're doing it beautifully. You're doing it the best that you can, and that's all you can do in the moment. So now let's think a little bit about maintaining our mental health or emotional health. Oftentimes, you know, most people have some sort of first aid kit at home with things like bandages, you know, alcohol pads. I can't even remember what all goes into a first aid kit any longer. But things that allow us to quickly respond when there's some sort of physical injury. Maybe we even have an emergency or an evacuation kit that's filled with extra supplies in case of a natural disaster. I think about the toilet paper shortage that I think most of us experienced at the beginning of this pandemic. And there's probably people that have hundreds of cases of toilet paper and bottled water in their basement. But oftentimes we're not prepared to survive and recover from any kind of psychological wound, and we can be if we create an emotional first aid kit. This might sound kind of cheesy, but it can be really fun. And I used to run a group where I would have people bring some sort of a basket or a bucket or a container, and we would actually build these first aid kits. And these are just some ideas of things that you can include. It's really open-ended, and it's whatever makes you feel good and promotes positivity, makes you feel a sense of calm, a sense of peace. What I would encourage is that you consider all of the senses. So in some of my clients' favorite ideas include, like a favorite type of tea or a chapstick, some sort of essential oil or a lotion that smells really good, some things with different textures for that tactile sense. So maybe a really soft blanket or a fuzzy pair of slippers. And then things to stimulate your brain. So maybe a journal, maybe a pen, maybe some of those adult coloring books or mandalas, things that can connect you to other people. So pictures, letters, emails, text messages. Really the sky is the limit here. But I would really encourage you to at least get started on creating this for yourself, because your kit it can be small and it can be super simple, but it can be really influential in having these tools ready when you need them. Because when we're really stressed or in crisis, like I mentioned earlier, that thinking part of our brain goes offline. So if we have something tangible in front of us to remind us of how to recover and what we need to do step by step to mitigate the stress response and to be able to access some of these higher level functioning skills, can be really, really helpful. And then having a plan to recover in advance. This sounds obvious, but believing that you'll recover is the most significant first step in recovery. So if we believe we're never going to be okay again, we probably won't. We call that catastrophic thinking. It's one of the most common cognitive distortions that we experience as humans. So considering that reframe again, that it feels like this will last forever, but I know that it won't. And then take action. So consider some of these suggestions on this slide, or maybe choose others that you already know work for you. If you know what you're going to do in an emotional event, you'll be more prepared to recover from challenges. So just like that emergency action plan for home or for work to plan for an external crisis, having a plan to deal with psychological crises can really help us recover and heal more effectively. So getting back to that unconditional acceptance that we talked about in the beginning. Another term for this is radical acceptance. And this is really where we begin to accept life on life's terms. It's not about resisting what you can't control or what you can't change. And it's really important when we talk about emotional first aid, because if we don't accept things as they are, then we put our energy into resisting it rather than recovering from it. And we all have finite amounts of energy as humans. So wouldn't it be great if we could figure out how to use that energy expenditure, most productively in ways that are going to be most useful for us and for other people? One of the biggest and most important ways to do this is by unconditionally accepting ourselves, including our choices and actions and our feelings, or accepting a situation for what it is when we don't have control over changing it. And in that moment, that frees us up to practice more of these EFA skills and to be able to cope more effectively. Acceptance, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it's a challenge, involves getting past shame. Oftentimes when an emotional event occurs, we have thoughts of guilt and regret that result in feelings of shame. And I really want to take a second and make sure that we're all on the same page of distinguishing shame versus guilt, because guilt is something that can be a really helpful feeling, and it can help us to make sure that our moral compass continues facing due north, because guilt is focused on a behavior. So it's about, I made a mistake, I did something wrong, where shame is focused on the self. So shame is, I am a mistake, I am wrong, I am inherently flawed and unworthy of love and belonging. And so shame really blocks us from accepting ourselves. and it prevents us from believing that we have any kind of ability to handle an issue or a task at hand, which makes people feel trapped, powerless, isolated. Oh. So shame is something that makes us keep what we think and feel, or even things that we do, our behaviors, a secret. It's a really common feeling with people who are excessively drinking, using drugs, or even thinking about suicide. It keeps that internal reel of negativity and criticism and self-judgment rolling. It allows us to deny that there's anything wrong and pretend that there's not a problem. It causes and exacerbates feelings of anxiety about the future, and oftentimes anxiety can be manifested in anger. Anger is a secondary emotion. There's always something driving it, and oftentimes some of the most common precursors to anger or triggers for anger are fear and anxiety. And it can also make us less likely to reach out and ask for any kind of help. And therefore, if we don't ask for help, if we don't acknowledge that there is a problem or an issue, then it's really hard, if not impossible, to change. So one of the best ways to combat shame and to overcome shame is to practice this unconditional acceptance. It's to unconditionally accept ourselves and others, to realize that as humans, we're all connected to other humans through this shared characteristic of being imperfect, right? Of making mistakes. We are flawed. And we can practice and build a new way of thinking, of feeling, of saying and doing something until it becomes a habit that can actually compete with our old habit of shame. And there's this terminology called neuroplasticity that is really about what fires together wires together. And so the more times, every single time that we have a new thought, a new behavior, a new experience, different neurons in our brain are firing, and they're connecting with other neurons. Now, the first 1, 3, 5, 10, maybe 100 times that we do something or think about something, those neural pathways might not stick. But the more consistent we can be over time, what fires together will eventually wire together, and those will become the superhighways in our brain for thought patterns, for automatic thoughts, for ways of responding. So one of the ways that you can practice this unconditional acceptance and to combat that, maybe that reel of negativity or shame-based statements, is to practice reading some of these affirmations every single day for 3 weeks. And I really encourage people to do this out loud and preferably in front of a mirror, because there's something about saying it to yourself that can be incredibly powerful. But this can really help us to reframe how we view our past and our present behaviors, can influence the way that we respond to future events, our future behaviors, and help us to forgive ourselves and have more appropriate and helpful feelings about the things that we're currently going through and things that we have gone through in the past. So I really love this quote. And actually, I want to back up for 1 second because I have a couple more minutes before I have to, before we're going to stop for questions. And I just want to clarify a question I get a lot about unconditional acceptance. This isn't saying that abuse is okay, or that unfairness is okay, or that what we did or what someone else did was just fine and we'll keep making the same mistake over and over, or that we're happy that, you know, a building is burning down, or that our president has coronavirus, or that someone in the next cubicle is suffering some sort of insurmountable injury. What it means is that we're accepting our present circumstances for what they are. It means that this is what happened, and we can ask ourselves what needs to be done to be able to manage it. So I hope that that makes a little bit more, that distinction makes a little bit more sense and can provide a little bit of clarity. So now one of this great quote that came from the staff at IBH When you go into the woods and you look at the trees, you see all these different trees. And some of them are bent and some of them are straight, some of them are evergreens, some of them are whatever. And you look at the tree and you allow it. You see it the way that it is. You sort of understand that it didn't get enough light and so it turned that way. And you don't get emotional about it. You just allow it. You appreciate the tree. The minute you get near humans, you lose all of that. And you're constantly saying, you're to this or I'm to this. That judging mind comes in. So I practice turning people into trees, which means appreciating them just the way they are. And I love this quote because I think, for a number of reasons, but I think it really encapsulates what it means to practice mindfulness. The kind of pillars of mindfulness that I mentioned earlier about being present in the moment and also maintaining a non-judgmental attitude toward yourself, toward the situation, for accepting it for what it is. It's kind of the beginning of that serenity prayer, learning to control the things you can and let go of the things that you can't. I can never remember how that goes, but I'm sure everyone has heard of it. So I encourage everyone to incorporate mindfulness into your daily life. And particularly when we're talking about emotional first aid and recovering from some of the turmoil that our world is in right now, because it's really easy to get caught up and hung up on the anxiety and the unknowns of the future. And I don't mean 3 months or 6 months from now, I mean tomorrow. And also to get really kind of engrossed in that what used to be mentality. And, I'm sure everyone is tired of hearing it, but we are going to be coming out of this, not going back to a place of normal, but trying to navigate and define and live in a very new normal for most of us. Okay, well, thank you everyone for participating, and thank you, Brenda, for putting this on behind the scenes.